Welcome to my channel Secret of America. One oppressive August afternoon, Catherine Marlowe stood on the veranda of Oakidge Plantation, fanning herself against the heat, when she first spotted him. A wagon made its way up the long dirt road, stirring dust that hovered in the still air like a veil. Beside the driver sat her husband, Richard Marlowe, talking with his usual animated excitement whenever he believed he'd secured a smart purchase. But it was the chained figure in the back that made Catherine's breath stop. He was massive. Even seated, slumped forward with wrists shackled to the wagon bed, he dwarfed the two guards on either side. His shoulders were so wide they appeared to blot out the sun behind him. His hands, though bound, seemed capable of crushing a man's skull without effort. Yet something strange lingered about him, a quality Catherine couldn't name. He kept his head low, his posture yielding, almost beaten. A wet, rattling cough escaped him now and then, hinting at sickness. His clothes hung loosely, as though he'd recently lost weight. "Catherine," Richard called as the wagon halted. "Come see what I've bought. Wait till you see the size of this one. He'll do the labor of 3 men." Catherine descended the steps slowly, her silk skirts whispering, her hand tight on the railing. Over the years, she'd watched many enslaved people arrive at Oakidge. 43 currently worked the plantation, but none had ever looked quite like this. As she drew nearer, the giant lifted his head just enough for her to glimpse his eyes. Dark and sharp, for an instant something flickered there, something almost like measuring, before he dropped his gaze again and coughed into his shackled hands. "He's ill," Catherine said, stepping back by instinct. "Richard, you didn't pay full price for a sick slave, did you?" Richard laughed, the sound booming across the yard. "Minor ailment, nothing more." The seller swore it's just travel fatigue. "A few days of rest and proper food, and he'll be as strong as an ox." "Look at that frame, Catherine. Those arms, those shoulders. I got him for half the usual cost because of that cough. Deal of the year." Catherine wasn't convinced. Something about the giant troubled her, though she couldn't say what. Maybe it was how he carried himself, that odd mix of seeming frailty and coiled strength. Or maybe it was something in his eyes during that fleeting moment he'd looked at her. A depth that held more awareness than felt comfortable. "What's his name?" she asked. "Calls himself Jonas," Richard replied, motioning for the guards to unchain him. "Says he was a field hand on a South Carolina plantation before his master died and the estate was sold off. Hard worker, no record of running or rebellion. Perfect addition to our operation." As the chains came off, Jonas rose slowly, and Catherine had to tip her head back to meet his gaze. He must have stood nearly 7 feet tall, with a build that suggested immense power despite his apparent illness. He swayed slightly, as if dizzy, and caught himself on the wagon. One guard chuckled. "Steady, big man. Wouldn't want you to fall and hurt yourself before you've done any work." Jonas said nothing, just nodded meekly and let himself be led toward the slave quarters. Catherine watched him go, that uneasy feeling lodged in her chest like a stone. Raised on a plantation, she'd spent all her 28 years in the world of enslavement and had developed instincts about the people her husband owned. Something about Jonas felt off. Not exactly dangerous, he seemed too weak, too submissive for that, but wrong nonetheless. "You worry too much," Richard said, draping an arm over her shoulders. "He's just a big, simple field hand. Nothing to fret over. Now, shall we head inside? I'm starving, and I'm sure Bessie has made something delicious for dinner." Catherine let herself be guided indoors, but she glanced back once more at Jonas's figure disappearing into the quarters. She couldn't shake the sense that her husband had brought something onto their plantation that would change everything. She just didn't yet know if that change would be for good or ill. What Catherine didn't know, what no one at Oakidge Plantation knew, was that Jonas wasn't his real name. That he'd never been a field hand in South Carolina. That he had never been submissive, simple, or weak. And that the cough, the hunched posture, the appearance of illness were all carefully constructed lies designed for one specific purpose: infiltration. His true name was Elijah. He was 32 years old, and he was a hunter. Before we continue with this revenge story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment which city you're listening from. Thank you, and let's keep going. 6 months earlier, February 1857, Tennessee. Elijah had been born free in a small community of free black people in the Tennessee mountains. His father, Samuel, was a legendary tracker and hunter who had escaped slavery 20 years before Elijah's birth and had never been recaptured. Samuel taught his son everything about tracking game, reading forest signs, understanding animal behavior, moving silently through wilderness, and most crucially, how to think like a predator. A hunter doesn't chase his prey, Samuel told him when he was still a boy. A hunter studies his prey. Learns its habits, its weaknesses, its fears, and then sets a trap so perfect that the prey walks right into it willingly. Elijah became one of the finest hunters in the region, supplying meat for his community and occasionally guiding wealthy white men on expeditions, men who paid well and never questioned his status because his skills were too valuable. He had a wife, a small cabin, and a life that, while not easy in a nation that despised his skin color, even when he was technically free, was at least his own. Then, 3 years ago, everything changed. His mother, Ruth, had been born into slavery on a Georgia plantation called Oakidge. She'd escaped when Elijah was just an infant, traveling hundreds of miles north with him wrapped against her chest, following the North Star and whispered directions from the Underground Railroad. She'd found Samuel, built a life, tasted freedom. But 20 years later, slave catchers found her. They came at night with dogs, chains, and a legal document declaring her the property of Richard Marlowe of Oakidge Plantation, Georgia. The law didn't care that she'd lived free for 2 decades. Didn't care that she had a husband and a grown son. Didn't care that forcing her back into slavery was a cruelty defying every notion of human decency. The Fugitive Slave Act was clear: escaped slaves could be captured and returned to their owners, no matter how long they'd been free, no matter where they were found. Elijah had been away on a hunting trip when it happened. By the time he returned, his mother was gone. His father had tried to stop them and was beaten so badly he couldn't walk. The cabin was ransacked, and pinned to the door was a notice: property of Richard Marlowe, Oakidge Plantation, Georgia, legally reclaimed. Elijah held his father as the old man wept. Samuel, who had escaped slavery and built a life and taught his son to be strong and free, had been powerless to protect the woman he loved. "I'm sorry," Samuel kept saying. "I'm sorry. I couldn't stop them. Too many of them. I couldn't stop them." "It's not your fault," Elijah told him. But inside, a cold fury was building. His mother was back in chains because of a man named Richard Marlowe. Back on a plantation called Oakidge. Back in a world of violence, degradation, and stolen humanity. And Elijah was going to get her back. But he wasn't foolish. He knew he couldn't simply walk onto a plantation and demand his mother's release. A direct assault would leave him dead or enslaved himself. So he did what his father taught him: he studied his prey. He learned everything about Oakidge Plantation, Richard Marlowe, the property's layout, the number of overseers, the security measures. What he learned was daunting. Oakidge was one of Georgia's largest plantations, with over 400 acres of cotton and tobacco. Richard Marlowe was wealthy, well-connected, and known for his harsh treatment of enslaved people. The plantation employed 6 armed, experienced overseers. There were dogs, patrols, and a reputation for brutally punishing any escape attempt. A direct rescue was impossible. But infiltration, that might work. So Elijah devised a plan audacious to the point of madness. He would get himself sold to Richard Marlowe. He would enter Oakidge not as a rescuer but as property. Once inside, he would gather information, find his mother, and execute an escape that would free not just her but as many others as possible. And in the process, he would destroy Richard Marlowe's operation so completely that the men would never recover. It took 6 months of preparation. Elijah had to learn to act like an enslaved person, adopting the posture, speech patterns, and submissive behavior white people expected. He had to suppress every instinct that made him free and strong. He had to become, at least outwardly, the kind of property that would be bought and sold. The hardest part was allowing himself to be captured. He traveled south to the edges of slave territory and deliberately let a slave patrol find him. He claimed to be a runaway from a South Carolina plantation, gave false information about his owner, acted confused, frightened, weak. The patrol believed him because he gave them what they expected, a big, simple Negro who'd made a foolish try for freedom and was now resigned to his fate. They took him to a slave jail in Augusta, where he spent 2 weeks in chains, continuing his performance. He developed a convincing cough by breathing in dust and irritating his throat. He hunched his shoulders and moved slowly, as if exhausted. He spoke in deferential tones, always averting his eyes, always acting beaten into submission. When the traders began preparing for the next auction, Elijah made sure he was placed in the questionable health category, valuable for his size but risky due to apparent illness. He knew Richard Marlowe frequented these auctions looking for bargains, enslaved people he could buy cheaply because of some minor defect and then work to death in his fields. Sure enough, on auction day, Richard Marlowe was there. And when Elijah was brought onto the block, hunched and coughing, his massive frame hidden beneath a posture of weakness, Marlowe's eyes lit up with greed. Here was an enslaved man who looked capable of tremendous work, available at a discount because of a temporary illness. The bidding was brief. Most buyers were skeptical of the cough, worried about disease. But Marlowe was confident. When the auction ended, Elijah had a new owner. He had successfully infiltrated Oakidge Plantation. Now came the hard part. The first week at Oakidge was designed to break him, to test whether he was worth Richard Marlowe's investment. Elijah was assigned to the cotton fields, the plantation's most brutal work, where men and women labored from dawn until well past dusk under overseers who carried whips and used them freely. The head overseer was Garrett Pike, a veteran of plantation management who'd worked at Oakidge for 15 years. Pike was a foot shorter than Elijah but carried himself with the confidence of someone holding absolute power over other human beings. On Elijah's first morning, Pike looked him up and down with undisguised contempt. "So," Pike said, circling Elijah like a predator examining prey, "you're the giant the master bought." Big man with a cough. "Let's see if you can actually work or if the master wasted his money." Elijah kept his head down, said nothing, maintaining the submissive posture he'd perfected. Pike smiled, a cruel expression that didn't reach his eyes. "You'll be in the West Field starting today. Pick cotton from sunup to sundown. Fill your basket to the top, same as everyone else. Fall behind, and you'll be encouraged to work faster. Slack off, and you'll be reminded of your place. Cause any trouble, and you'll learn why runaways from Oakidge are so rare. Understand?" "Yes, sir," Elijah said quietly, injecting just the right amount of fear into his voice. "Good. Now get to work." The West Field stretched for acres, rows of cotton plants heavy with bolls to be picked. 40 enslaved people worked the field, their fingers moving with practiced efficiency, plucking cotton into large baskets strapped to their backs. An overseer patrolled on horseback, a whip coiled at his belt, watching for any sign of slowing. Elijah took his place at the end of a row and began picking. His massive hands, which could track a deer for miles and set traps the craftiest predators couldn't avoid, now performed the mindless, repetitive task of pulling cotton from plants. He worked slowly at first, maintaining his weak appearance, coughing periodically to remind everyone of his supposed illness. But he was also observing, watching the overseer's patrol patterns, counting how many guards were visible, noting which enslaved people seemed broken and which still had fight in their eyes, learning the field's layout, the tree line's location, the distances to various buildings. Every detail was stored away, pieces of a puzzle he was slowly assembling. By midday, his basket was only half full, far behind the others. The mounted overseer noticed and rode over, stopping his horse inches from Elijah. "You're slow, big man. Very slow. Surely a giant like you can pick faster than that." Elijah coughed and kept his eyes down. "Sorry, sir. Still feeling weak. I'll work faster." The overseer considered this, then without warning struck Elijah across the back with his whip. The pain was sharp and immediate, but Elijah forced himself not to react beyond a small flinch. He'd known pain before: knife wounds from hunting accidents, broken bones from falls, burns from campfires. This was nothing he couldn't handle. But more importantly, he couldn't show strength, couldn't reveal that he was more than he appeared. "That's to help you remember to work faster," the overseer said. "Next time I come by, your basket better be fuller, or you'll get more than one." "Yes, sir," Elijah whispered. The overseer rode off, and Elijah resumed picking, now moving slightly faster but still maintaining his performance of weakness. An older woman working nearby glanced at him with sympathy. "Don't let them break you on the first day," she said quietly. "Pace yourself. Show just enough effort that they don't kill you, but not so much that they expect it every day." "Thank you," Elijah said, and meant it. This woman, her name was Abigail, he would later learn, had been at Oakidge for 20 years. She knew how to survive. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became crushing. Sweat poured down Elijah's face and back. His hands, despite their size and strength, began to ache from the repetitive motion. But this was nothing compared to tracking game for days through mountain wilderness. This was nothing compared to what his mother was enduring somewhere on this plantation. That thought kept him going. Ruth was here, within these 400 acres. His mother was working, suffering, enduring. He just had to find her. By evening, when the bell finally rang to end the workday, Elijah's basket was nearly full, not the fullest, but respectable enough that the overseers didn't punish him further. The enslaved people trudged back to their quarters, a collection of rough wooden cabins housing the plantation's labor force. The cabins were cramped, poorly maintained, and offered minimal protection from the elements. But they were shelter, and after 16 hours of work, even a thin mattress on a wooden floor seemed like luxury. Elijah was assigned to a cabin with 5 other men, all field workers. They eyed him warily as he entered, taking in his size, his apparent weakness, his status as a newcomer. "You're the new giant?" asked one man, middle-aged with a scar across his cheek. His name was Moses. "Yes," Elijah said simply. "Pick much cotton today?" "Not enough." "Still sick?" Moses nodded, accepting this. "Get better fast. Master don't keep sick slaves long. Either you work, or you get sold south to the rice plantations, and nobody survives rice country." The other men murmured in agreement. Elijah filed this away, another puzzle piece. Oakidge was harsh, but apparently there were even worse places, and Marlowe wasn't above selling defective property to maximize profit. That night, lying on his thin mattress while the others slept, Elijah began his real work. He'd spent the day observing, learning the surface details of plantation life. But nights would be for deeper intelligence gathering, moving silently through darkness, avoiding detection, collecting the kind of information that would make his eventual plan possible. He waited until the cabin was silent except for snoring, then rose carefully. His size made stealth challenging, but his father had taught him how to move without sound, how to distribute his weight, how to breathe so quietly that even animals wouldn't detect him. These skills, honed over decades of hunting, now served a different purpose. He slipped out of the cabin into the humid Georgia night. The plantation was quiet but not unguarded. Elijah could see torches in the distance where overseers maintained patrol routes. He could hear dogs barking somewhere beyond the main house, bloodhounds, probably, trained to track runaways. This would require careful navigation. He moved through the shadows between buildings, staying low, avoiding open spaces. His destination tonight was simple reconnaissance: learn the quarters layout, identify which cabins housed which groups, locate the main house, overseer residences, storage buildings, basic intelligence for more complex operations later. As he crept past the women's quarters, he heard quiet weeping from inside one cabin. He paused, listening. An older woman's voice, speaking in a tone that suggested she was comforting someone younger. The words were indistinct, but the emotion was clear: pain, loss, exhaustion. His mother was in one of these cabins. He didn't know which one yet, didn't dare risk searching tonight, still learning the patrol patterns. But knowing she was close made his chest tighten with emotion he couldn't afford to indulge. Not yet. Not until he had a plan that would actually work. He continued his circuit, noting everything. The main house was large and well lit even at night, with at least 2 people visible through windows, house slaves probably, working late. The overseer cabins were positioned strategically around the property, ensuring no area was completely unwatched. The storage buildings, where tools and supplies were kept, were locked but not heavily guarded. And in the distance, he could see the forest edge bordering the plantation, dark, dense, offering potential escape routes if needed. After an hour of reconnaissance, Elijah returned to his cabin and slipped back onto his mattress. None of the other men had stirred. He lay there in the darkness, processing what he'd learned, beginning to form the outline of a plan that would require patience, precision, and a level of deception he'd never attempted before. He would need to maintain his performance of weakness for weeks, maybe months, long enough to earn a degree of trust, or at least to be dismissed as harmless. Long enough to learn more about the overseers, their personalities, weaknesses, habits. Long enough to make contact with his mother and assess her condition. Long enough to identify allies among the enslaved who might risk everything for freedom. And then, when the time was right, he would stop being Jonas the weak field hand and become Elijah the hunter once more. And Richard Marlowe's plantation would learn what it meant to be prey. The next morning came too early, announced by a bell that rang across the plantation at dawn. The enslaved rose immediately, knowing delays meant punishment. They were given a brief period to eat a meager breakfast of cornmeal mush and water before being marched back to the fields. Elijah fell into the routine, continuing his performance. He picked cotton slowly but steadily, just fast enough to avoid beatings, not so fast as to seem healthy. He coughed at regular intervals. He hunched his shoulders and moved as if every step required effort. And he watched constantly, gathering more information. On the 3rd day, he made his first important discovery. During the midday break, when the enslaved were allowed a few minutes to drink water and rest, he noticed a woman working in the adjacent field who moved with a familiar grace despite her obvious exhaustion. She was in her 50s, with gray threading through her hair. Even from a distance, even after 3 years apart, Elijah recognized her. Ruth. His mother. Every instinct screamed at him to go to her, to speak to her, to assure her that help had come. But he forced himself to remain still. Any unusual behavior would be noted by the overseers. Any connection between them would be remembered. He couldn't risk it. Not yet. But knowing she was there, seeing with his own eyes that she was alive, gave him renewed determination. She looked older than he remembered, thinner, with a weariness that broke his heart. But she was alive, and he was going to get her out. That evening, he learned more about the plantation's hierarchy through conversations with his cabin mates. Moses, the scarred man, was surprisingly talkative once he decided Elijah wasn't a threat. "Master Marlowe, he's mean but predictable," Moses explained as they ate their evening rations. "Long as you work hard and don't cause trouble, he mostly leaves you alone. It's the mistress you got to watch out for." "The mistress?" Elijah asked, remembering the pale woman who had watched him arrive. "Catherine Marlowe," another man said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She's worse than the master in some ways. Master beats you when you fail. Mistress beats you when she's bored. And she's always watching, always suspicious. You can't trust her. Not for a second." This was concerning. Elijah had been so focused on Richard Marlowe that he hadn't adequately considered his wife, a mistake he would need to correct. "What about the overseers?" he asked. "6 of them," Moses said. "Pike's the worst. He's been here forever and knows every trick. Then there's Turner, Crawford, and the others. All armed, all mean, and they work shifts, so there's always someone watching. And then there's the dogs." "How many dogs?" 5 bloodhounds. Big ones, trained to track runaways. They've caught every slave who's tried to escape in the last 10 years. Those dogs are the real reason nobody runs. You can maybe outsmart the overseers, but you can't outsmart a bloodhound's nose." Elijah filed this away. 5 dogs, fewer than he'd feared. And dogs, despite their reputation, were animals with predictable behaviors. He'd hunted with dogs, tracked with dogs, and most importantly, learned how to evade them when necessary. They weren't invincible. "Anyone ever succeed in escaping?" he asked casually. The cabin fell silent. Moses looked at him with something like pity. "Why you asking? You thinking about running, big man? You'll be dead in a week. Or worse, caught and made an example of. Master Marlowe don't just whip runaways. He breaks them. Makes them wish they'd never been born. And then he sells them south to places where they work you to death in 6 months. Don't even think about it." "I'm not," Elijah lied. "Just curious." But the conversation told him something important. The enslaved at Oakidge had been so thoroughly broken, so convinced of escape's impossibility, that they wouldn't even consider it. This meant he couldn't count on mass cooperation. When the time came, he would have to act with a small, trusted group, or possibly alone. Over the following weeks, Elijah settled into the brutal routine of plantation life while secretly continuing his nocturnal reconnaissance. He mapped every building, every patrol route, every dog kennel. He identified where supplies were stored, where weapons were kept, where overseers slept. He learned which guards were alert and which were lazy, which dogs were truly dangerous and which were mostly for show. And gradually, carefully, he began making contact with enslaved people who seemed like potential allies. Not many. Trust was a luxury the enslaved couldn't afford, but a few. Abigail, the older woman who'd shown him kindness on his first day, a young man named Samuel, who still had fire in his eyes, a woman named Clara, who worked in the main house and had access to information about the Marlowe schedules and habits. He didn't reveal his true purpose, not yet. He simply established himself as someone who listened, who was thoughtful, who might be more than he appeared. Seeds that would grow when the time came. A month after his arrival, Elijah finally found an opportunity to speak directly with his mother. It happened during a Sunday afternoon, the one time when the enslaved were given a few hours of rest. He had learned that Ruth spent her Sundays in a small garden behind the women's quarters, tending vegetables that supplemented the plantation's food supplies. He approached carefully, making sure no overseers were watching. When he was close enough, he spoke quietly without looking directly at her. "Mama." Ruth's hands froze over the tomato plant she'd been tending. Her breath caught. Slowly she turned to look at him, and Elijah saw recognition dawn in her eyes, followed immediately by terror. "No," she whispered. "No, you can't be here." "Elijah, what have you done?" "I came for you," he said simply. "I came to take you home." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "You fool. You beautiful, stupid fool. Do you know what they'll do if they find out? Do you know what they'll do to both of us? They won't find out. Not until it's too late." "How?" Her voice was desperate. "How can you possibly, Elijah? There are 6 overseers, 5 dogs, patrols every night. Master Marlowe is connected to every sheriff and slave catcher in 3 counties. Even if we ran, we'd be caught before we made it 10 miles. "Then we don't run," Elijah said. "Not yet. Not until I've prepared everything. Mama, trust me. I'm not the boy you raised. I'm a hunter, and I've spent the last month learning everything about this place. When I move, it will work. I promise you." Ruth stared at him, seeing for the first time that her son had become something formidable, something dangerous. "What do you need from me?" she finally asked. "Information about the Marlows, about the house, about anything useful. And patience. This won't happen tomorrow, but it will happen." Over the next several minutes, speaking in urgent whispers, Ruth shared everything she knew. She told him about Richard Marlowe's schedule, his quarterly business trips to Savannah. She told him about Catherine's habits, her tendency to ride out to the fields on horseback to inspect the work. She told him about the main house's layout, including a study where Marlowe kept his personal weapons and papers. Most importantly, she told him about the one night each year when the plantation's guard was at its lowest, the harvest celebration. It was a tradition at Oakidge. When the cotton harvest was complete, Richard Marlowe hosted a large party for neighboring plantation owners. The event required all house slaves to work in the main house, and the overseers were often drunk by midnight, celebrating with the white guests. It was the only time security was truly lax. "When is the harvest celebration this year?" Elijah asked. 6 weeks. Early October." "Perfect." Elijah felt pieces of his plan clicking into place. "That's when we move." "We?" Ruth asked. "We can't free everyone. Even if we could escape ourselves, trying to take 40 other people, not 40, Elijah interrupted. "But not just 2, either. I've been watching, Mama. There are people here who deserve freedom, who would fight for it if they believed it was possible. We're going to give them that chance." Ruth looked at her son, this man who had infiltrated a plantation, who had spent weeks playing weak while gathering intelligence, who spoke with quiet confidence born of genuine capability rather than bravado, and felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. "Hope. Tell me your plan," she said. And for the next 20 minutes, while pretending to work in the garden, Elijah outlined exactly how he intended to destroy Richard Marlowe's operation and free not just his mother but as many enslaved people as were willing to risk everything for liberation. It was audacious. It was dangerous. It relied on perfect timing and flawless execution. But it could work. And that night, as Elijah lay in his cabin pretending to sleep, he allowed himself a small smile. The trap was set. The prey had no idea what was coming. And in 6 weeks, Oakidge Plantation would learn what happened when you enslaved a hunter's mother. The giant they thought they'd bought wasn't weak, wasn't simple, wasn't broken. He was the most dangerous man they'd ever encounter, and their time was running out. The 6 weeks between Elijah's conversation with his mother and the harvest celebration passed with agonizing slowness, each day a carefully choreographed performance of submission while he refined every detail of his plan. The work in the cotton fields continued its brutal rhythm, dawn to dusk, 6 days a week, with only Sunday afternoons offering any respite. But Elijah used every moment strategically, turning his enslavement into an extended reconnaissance mission. His illness began to show signs of improvement, slowly, gradually, in a way that seemed natural. He coughed less frequently. His posture straightened slightly. His cotton picking increased from half a basket per day to 3/4, then to a full basket. The overseers noticed and were pleased. Their investment was paying off. Richard Marlowe himself commented during one of his infrequent visits to the fields that the giant was finally earning his keep. Catherine Marlowe, however, remained suspicious. Elijah noticed her watching him more than the other slaves, her eyes narrowed as if trying to solve a puzzle she couldn't quite articulate. She would ride out to the fields on her chestnut mare, ostensibly to inspect the work, but Elijah could feel her gaze lingering on him longer than necessary. It was unsettling, this attention, but he never acknowledged it, never gave her any reason to think he was anything other than what he appeared to be. During the 4th week of his preparation, Catherine approached him directly. It was midday, the sun blazing overhead, and Elijah was drinking water from the communal bucket when her horse stopped beside him. He immediately lowered his eyes, the gesture of deference so practiced now it was almost natural. "You," she said, her voice sharp. "Jonas, isn't it?" "Yes, ma'am," Elijah replied quietly, not looking up. "You've been here a month now. You're working better. Stronger." "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you, ma'am. Look at me when I speak to you." Elijah raised his eyes slowly, making sure his expression showed nothing but respectful attention. Catherine studied his face for a long moment, her own expression unreadable. "There's something about you," she said finally. "Something I can't quite identify. You're different from the others. Smarter, perhaps. More aware." Every instinct screamed at Elijah to deny this, to deflect, to return to his performance of simple-minded obedience. But Catherine was perceptive in a way her husband wasn't, and complete denial might seem suspicious in itself. So he chose a middle path. "Just trying to work hard, ma'am. Trying to be useful. Don't want to be sold south." Catherine's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Sold south? Yes, that's every slave's nightmare, isn't it? The rice plantations, the sugar fields, places where Negroes die faster than they can be replaced." She paused, watching his reaction. "Are you afraid of that, Jonas?" "Yes, ma'am," Elijah said honestly, because that much was true. He had heard the stories of those plantations, where enslaved people were literally worked to death within months. It was a fate he wouldn't wish on anyone. "Good. Fear keeps you obedient. Fear keeps you alive." Catherine turned her horse to leave, then stopped. "My husband thinks he got a bargain when he bought you. A strong worker at half price because of a temporary illness. But I wonder if perhaps you're more trouble than you're worth." She rode away without waiting for a response, leaving Elijah standing there with his heart pounding. This was dangerous. Catherine's suspicion, even if she couldn't articulate exactly what she suspected, was a threat to everything he'd planned. He would need to be even more careful around her. That evening, he shared his concern with Ruth during one of their carefully arranged brief encounters. They had developed a system where they could exchange a few words during Sunday afternoons without attracting attention, and occasionally, when Ruth was assigned to work in the vegetable garden, Elijah could engineer reasons to be nearby. "Catherine's always been like that," Ruth said quietly, her hands moving mechanically as she pulled weeds. "She watches everyone, looking for signs of resistance, of intelligence, of anything that might threaten their control. But she can't do anything based on suspicion alone. Just keep being what they expect to see. What if she convinces Marlowe to sell me before the harvest celebration? She won't. Richard's too pleased with your cotton production. As long as you keep working hard, he won't get rid of you. Catherine may suspect something, but she has no proof, and Richard doesn't listen to her hunches." Elijah nodded, filing this away. It highlighted something he'd already observed: the marriage between Richard and Catherine Marlowe was not one of equals. Catherine was intelligent and perceptive, but in the world they inhabited, her opinions mattered less than her husband's financial calculations. As long as Elijah was profitable, he was safe. During the 5th week, Elijah began the most dangerous phase of his preparation: recruiting allies. He had identified 5 enslaved people who seemed like potential collaborators, people who still had fight in them, who weren't completely broken by the system. The challenge was approaching them without revealing too much, without creating a conspiracy so large that someone might betray it out of fear or hope of reward. His first recruit was Abigail, the older woman who had shown him kindness on his first day. She was 57, had been enslaved at Oakidge for 22 years, and had a quiet strength that came from surviving unspeakable hardships. Elijah approached her one Sunday afternoon, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "Abigail, can I ask you something? If you had a chance, a real chance to be free, would you take it? Even if it meant risking your life?" Abigail's hands stilled over the quilt she was mending. She didn't look at him, but her voice, when she spoke, was steady. "Every slave dreams of freedom, Jonas. But dreams don't mean anything when the reality is dogs and whips and slave catchers. Why are you asking? Because dreams can become reality if you plan carefully enough. If you're willing to be patient. If you're willing to fight when the moment comes." Now Abigail did look at him, her eyes searching his face. "Who are you really? You're not what you pretend to be, are you?" "I'm someone who keeps promises," Elijah said. "And I promised myself I'd free my mother from this place. But I can't do it alone. I need people I can trust. People willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom." "Your mother," Abigail repeated slowly. "Ruth, the woman in the vegetable garden. I should have seen it. You have her eyes. Will you help?" Abigail was silent for a long moment, weighing the risk against the possibility. Finally, she nodded. "What do you need me to do?" Over the next 2 weeks, Elijah carefully recruited 4 more allies: Samuel, a 23-year-old field hand who had seen his wife sold away the previous year and burned with quiet rage; Clara, who worked in the main house and had access to information about the Marlowe's routines; Moses, the scarred man from Elijah's cabin who had lived at Oakidge long enough to know every detail of its operation; and a woman named Hannah who worked in the kitchen and could provide access to certain supplies when needed. To each of them, Elijah revealed only what they needed to know. He told them that during the harvest celebration, when security would be at its weakest, they would make their move. He told them he had a plan that would give them a genuine chance at freedom. He told them it would be dangerous, that some of them might not survive, but that the alternative was remaining enslaved for the rest of their lives. All of them agreed to help. Because even the smallest possibility of freedom was better than the certainty of bondage. The harvest celebration was scheduled for the first Saturday in October. As the date approached, Elijah could feel tension building in his chest, a mix of anticipation and fear that he worked hard to conceal. Everything he had planned for the past 2 months would come down to a single night. If it worked, they would be free. If it failed, they would all die horribly. 3 days before the celebration, Richard Marlowe called all the enslaved together in the yard for an announcement, unusual, as he typically left such communications to the overseers. Apparently this warranted his personal attention. "The harvest is complete," Marlowe announced, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "Thanks to your hard work," he said this as if they had any choice in the matter, "we've had our best cotton yield in 5 years. This Saturday, I'll be hosting plantation owners from across the county to celebrate our success. All house slaves will be working in the main house to serve our guests. The rest of you will remain in your quarters and will not, under any circumstances, venture near the main house. Is that understood?" A murmured chorus of "Yes, Master" rippled through the crowd. "Good. And just to ensure everyone remains where they belong, the overseers will be conducting periodic checks of the quarters throughout the evening. Anyone found where they shouldn't be will be dealt with severely." Elijah listened with a sinking feeling. Periodic checks of the quarters would complicate his plan significantly. He had been counting on the overseers being distracted by the party, drinking with the guests, their attention focused on the main house rather than the slave quarters. This new security measure was a problem. That evening, he gathered his small group of allies behind the storage barn, where they could speak without being overheard. "We have a problem," he told them, explaining about the planned checks. "If the overseers are patrolling regularly, it's going to be much harder to move without being detected. So what do we do?" Samuel asked, his voice tight with tension. "Call it off." "No," Elijah said firmly. "We adapt. This might actually work in our favor if we're smart about it. Think about it, if the overseers are checking the quarters, that means they're moving around, not stationary. They're predictable. And predictable patterns can be exploited." "How?" Clara asked. Elijah thought for a moment, his mind working through the logistics. "How many overseers total?" "6, Moses answered. "Pike, Turner, Crawford, Bennett, Hayes, and the new one, Dalton." "And how many will be needed at the main house to supervise the house slaves and keep order among the drunk guests?" Clara, who worked in the house and understood its operations, considered this. "At least 3, maybe 4. Master Marlowe won't want any trouble in front of his guests. He'll want his best overseers there to make sure everything runs smoothly. So that leaves 2, maybe 3 overseers to patrol the quarters," Elijah said, calculating. 43 slaves spread across a dozen cabins. That's a lot of ground to cover. They'll have to move in a pattern, a route that lets them check each cabin efficiently. And patterns can be timed. Understanding began to dawn on the others' faces. Moses nodded slowly. "If we can figure out their route, we can stay one step ahead of them. Move when they're checking the far cabins, be back in place before they circle around." "Exactly," Elijah said. "But we need to know their pattern, which means we need someone on the inside who can observe and report." "I can do that," Hannah said. A quiet woman in her 40s, easily overlooked, which made her perfect for observation. "I'll be working in the kitchen during the party. I can watch when the overseers come and go, track their timing, and pass information to Clara. And I can get messages to whoever needs them," Clara added. "I'll be serving in the dining room, moving between the main house and the kitchen. I can act as a courier." Elijah felt the plan coming together, adapting to the new constraints. "Good. Here's what we do." Hannah tracks the overseer patrol pattern during the first hour of the party and gets the information to Clara. Clara passes it to Moses, who'll be in the quarters coordinating timing. Once we know the pattern, we move during the gaps, when the overseers are furthest from their next checkpoint. Move where? Abigail asked. What exactly are we doing? This was the moment Elijah had to reveal the full scope of his plan. He took a deep breath and began to speak, laying out every detail of what he intended to do. First, we need to neutralize the dogs. The bloodhounds are kept in a kennel near the overseer cabins. They're the biggest threat to any escape because they can track us for miles. But dogs are predictable. They eat at the same time every day, fed by whoever's on dog duty. During the party, that'll probably be one of the younger overseers, someone not important enough to be at the main house. How do we neutralize them? Samuel asked. We make them sleep, Elijah said. Hannah, you have access to the kitchen supplies, right? Including the medicinal cabinet. Hannah nodded. Yes. Mrs. Marlowe keeps laudanum there for her headaches. It's a strong sedative. Perfect. We mix laudanum into the dog's evening meal. Not enough to kill them. I won't hurt animals just following their training, but enough to make them sleep deeply for several hours. Once the dogs are down, the biggest obstacle to our escape is gone. But we still have to deal with the overseers, Moses pointed out. Even if we can dodge their patrols, eventually they'll notice we're gone. And then they'll send riders, alert the sheriffs, organize a manhunt. Which is why we can't just run, Elijah said. We need to make sure they can't pursue us effectively. That means we need to disable their ability to chase us. He outlined the next phase. While the party was in full swing and the overseers were either drunk at the main house or distracted by their patrol duties, Elijah and Samuel would make their way to the stables. There they would release all the horses, not steal them, which would be noticed immediately, but simply open the gates and drive them into the fields, where they would scatter. Without horses, any pursuit would be on foot, giving the fugitives a significant head start. But the real key, Elijah continued, is destroying their records. Richard Marlowe keeps detailed documentation of every slave he owns, names, physical descriptions, ages, skills, everything a slave catcher would need to identify and pursue us. Those records are in his study, in a locked cabinet. Clara, you said you know where he keeps the key. Clara nodded. He keeps it on a chain around his neck. Never takes it off. Elijah smiled grimly. Then we'll need to get it from him. Which brings me to the most dangerous part of the plan. While Marlowe is drunk and distracted by his guests, I'm going to get into his study, retrieve those records, and destroy them. Without documentation, we become much harder to pursue. Slave catchers won't know exactly who they're looking for, won't have detailed descriptions to work with. That's insane, Moses said flatly. You're talking about walking into the main house during a party full of white people, stealing from the master while he's still awake, and walking back out. You'll be caught before you make it 10 feet. Not if I'm supposed to be there, Elijah countered. Not if I'm part of the serving staff for the evening. He explained his reasoning. Richard Marlowe had bragged repeatedly about his giant slave, the massive field hand he'd bought for half price, who was now one of his most productive workers. It would be entirely in character for Marlowe to show off his prize to his guests, to have the giant serve drinks or move furniture as a demonstration of his excellent slave management. All Elijah needed was to position himself in the right place at the right time. And Catherine, who managed the house slaves, might very well assign him to work the party. And if she doesn't? Abigail asked. Then I make sure she does. I'll volunteer. Act like I'm trying to be helpful to earn favor. She'll be suspicious. She's always suspicious. But she'll also be too busy managing a party for 40 guests to turn down free labor. The plan was audacious, filled with variables that could go wrong, but it was also the best chance they had. Over the next 2 days, they refined the details, assigned roles, identified fallback positions if things went wrong. Elijah drilled them on timing, on what to do if they were separated, on how to recognize the safe houses and underground railroad markers they might encounter once they made it past the immediate danger zone. And finally, Saturday arrived. The morning of the harvest celebration was chaotic. The main house was a hive of activity as house slaves prepared for the evening's festivities, tables set, food prepared, the best china and silver polished until they gleamed. In the fields, the remaining enslaved worked a half-day, finishing final tasks before being dismissed to their quarters for the duration of the party. Elijah worked mechanically, his mind focused on the evening ahead. Everything depended on precise timing, on a dozen small things going right, on luck and skill combining in the perfect measure. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, he felt the weight of what he was about to attempt settling on his shoulders. At 4 p.m., the enslaved were dismissed to their quarters. At 5 p.m., the guests began to arrive, plantation owners and their wives in fine carriages, dressed in expensive clothes, ready to celebrate another successful harvest built on the backs of enslaved labor. By 6 p.m., the party was in full swing, and Elijah made his move. He approached the main house through the kitchen entrance, where Hannah was working frantically to keep up with the demands of feeding 40 guests. She saw him and nodded almost imperceptibly, the signal that she'd already dosed the dog's evening meal with laudanum. Phase 1 was underway. "What are you doing here?" demanded the cook, a free black woman named Bessie who oversaw the kitchen. "You're supposed to be in the quarters." "I know, ma'am," Elijah said respectfully. "But I heard the mistress might need extra hands for the party, and I wanted to offer my help. I can carry heavy things, move furniture, whatever is needed." Bessie looked skeptical, but at that moment Catherine Marlowe swept into the kitchen, her face flushed with stress. "Bessie, we need more chairs brought in from the storage room, and the heavy ones are too much for the house boys. Do we have anyone?" She stopped when she saw Elijah. Her eyes narrowed. "What are you doing here, Jonas?" "Volunteering to help, ma'am. I'm strong. I can move whatever needs moving." Catherine studied him for a long moment, and Elijah could see the suspicion in her eyes, the same feeling that had made her watch him more closely than the other slaves. But she was also practical, and the party was demanding more labor than she had available. "Fine," she said finally. "You'll work under Clara's supervision. You do exactly what you're told, nothing more, nothing less. If I catch you anywhere you're not supposed to be, you'll regret it." "Understood." "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you, ma'am." And just like that, Elijah was inside the main house with legitimate reason to be there. He caught Clara's eye across the room, and she gave him the smallest nod. They were in. For the first 2 hours, Elijah played his role perfectly. He moved furniture, carried serving platters, refilled wine bottles, and generally made himself useful while staying as invisible as possible. He observed everything, the layout of the house, which he'd heard described but never seen firsthand, the locations of exits and hiding places, and most importantly, Richard Marlowe's behavior. The master was drinking heavily, becoming progressively louder and more boisterous as the evening wore on. He bragged about his cotton yield, his management techniques, his success as a plantation owner. Several times he gestured at the house slaves serving the party, referring to them as examples of well-trained property. When he spotted Elijah carrying a heavy table across the room, his eyes lit up. "There, you see that giant? Bought him for half price because the fool had a cough. But look at him now, strong as an ox, works like 3 men. That's the difference between a smart plantation owner and an amateur, knowing when you're getting value even in damaged goods." The guests laughed and applauded, and Elijah kept his face carefully neutral, playing the role of the obedient slave who didn't understand he was being discussed. But inside, he marked the moment, marked the casual dehumanization, the way Marlowe spoke about him as if he were livestock. Added it to the long list of reasons why what he was about to do was not just justified but necessary. By 9 p.m., Richard Marlowe was thoroughly drunk. So were most of his guests. The overseers assigned to the party, Pike, Turner, and Crawford, were drinking as well, their vigilance deteriorating with every glass of whiskey. And outside, according to the information Clara had passed him, the patrol pattern of the overseers checking the quarters had become predictable, cursory checks every 30 minutes, spending most of their time chatting with each other rather than actually searching. It was time. Elijah caught Clara's eye and nodded toward the hallway that led to Marlowe's study. She understood immediately and created a distraction, dropping a tray of glasses that shattered spectacularly on the floor, drawing everyone's attention. In the commotion, Elijah slipped down the hallway unseen. Marlowe's study was locked, but the door was old and the lock simple. Elijah had prepared for this, had hidden a thin piece of metal in his boot that morning. He worked it into the lock, feeling for the mechanism, and within 30 seconds heard the satisfying click of tumblers falling into place. He eased the door open, stepped inside, and closed it behind him. The study was exactly as Ruth had described, a large desk, bookshelves lining the walls, and in the corner, a locked cabinet where Marlowe kept his important papers and personal weapons. The cabinet was more secure than the door had been, and Elijah knew he couldn't pick this lock, not without tools he didn't have and time he couldn't spare. Which meant he needed the key. The key that hung on a chain around Richard Marlowe's neck. Elijah stood in the darkness of the study, considering his options. He could search for another way into the cabinet, but that would take time and might not succeed. He could abandon this part of the plan, but without destroying those records, their escape would be significantly more dangerous. Or he could do something audacious, something that would either work perfectly or get him killed. He chose audacity. Elijah left the study, slipped back down the hallway, and returned to the party. Richard Marlowe was now so drunk he was slurring his words, holding onto the table for balance. Perfect. Elijah approached with a wine bottle, playing the attentive servant. More wine, master, he asked quietly. Marlowe waved his glass in what might have been a nod. As Elijah poured, he stumbled, just slightly, just enough to jostle Marlowe's arm and spill wine down the front of his expensive jacket. "You clumsy fool!" Marlowe roared, suddenly furious despite his inebriation. Several guests turned to look. "Look what you've done. This jacket cost more than you're worth." "I'm so sorry, master," Elijah said, genuine fear in his voice, or what sounded like genuine fear. "Please let me help clean it. If we get water on it quickly, it might not stain." Still cursing, Marlowe allowed himself to be led from the room by Elijah and Clara, who had materialized at exactly the right moment. They took him to a small washroom off the kitchen, where Clara began dabbing at the wine stain with a wet cloth while Marlowe continued his drunken tirade. "Stupid, worthless, I should sell you south, rice plantations, teach you to be careful." While Clara worked on the jacket, Elijah positioned himself behind Marlowe, ostensibly to help remove the garment. His massive hands moved with surprising delicacy, and in the confusion of cloth and arms and Marlowe's drunken swaying, those hands found the chain around Marlowe's neck. A quick pull, a snap of cheap metal, and the chain came free. Elijah palmed the key and slipped it into his pocket in one smooth motion. "There, master," Clara said, stepping back. "I think we got most of it. It should be fine once it's properly cleaned." Marlowe was too drunk to notice the missing chain. He stumbled back toward the party, still cursing, while Elijah and Clara exchanged a brief, triumphant glance. They had the key. Elijah waited 10 minutes, making sure Marlowe was thoroughly distracted by his guests, then slipped back to the study. The key worked perfectly in the cabinet lock. Inside, he found exactly what he was looking for, a leather-bound ledger containing detailed records of every enslaved person on the plantation, names, ages, physical descriptions, skills, prices paid, punishments administered, everything a slave catcher would need to pursue them. He also found something unexpected, a loaded pistol and a small bag of coins, probably kept for emergencies. Elijah took both, the gun because he might need it, the money because they would definitely need it, and then turned his attention to the ledger. He couldn't simply steal it, its absence would be noticed immediately. But he could destroy its usefulness. He found Marlowe's ink pot and pen, and over the next 5 minutes, he systematically altered every entry. He changed names, mixed up ages, scrambled physical descriptions. When he was done, the ledger was worthless, a document so corrupted that no one could use it to identify specific enslaved people. But he wasn't finished. He took several pages from the ledger, specifically the pages listing him, his mother, and the 5 people escaping with them, and folded them into his pocket. Then he carefully returned everything else to the cabinet, locked it, and wiped down any surfaces he might have touched. As he left the study, he checked his internal clock. It was 10:15 p.m. According to the plan, Samuel should now be at the stables releasing the horses. Hannah should have confirmed that the dogs were asleep. Moses should be coordinating the gathering of supplies in the quarters. Everything was proceeding on schedule. Elijah returned to the party, played his role for another 30 minutes to establish that he hadn't been gone for any significant length of time, then quietly slipped out through the kitchen as the clock struck 11 p.m. The party was still going strong, the guests now so drunk they barely registered his departure. He made his way quickly to the quarters, moving through shadows, avoiding the patrol route he'd memorized. When he reached his cabin, he found Moses, Samuel, and Abigail already there, along with his mother and the others. They had gathered everything they could carry, food, water, blankets, a few tools. They were ready. The dogs? Elijah asked quietly. Sleeping like babies, Hannah confirmed. Won't wake up for hours. The horses? Samuel grinned. Scattered across 3 fields. They'll be chasing them down for days. The patrol just passed 5 minutes ago, Moses said. We have 25 minutes before they circle back. Elijah nodded. Then we go now. Stay close, stay quiet, and follow my lead. They moved as a group through the darkness, 8 people bound together by desperate hope and shared risk. Elijah led them not toward the main road, too obvious, too easily blocked, but toward the forest that bordered the plantation's eastern edge. He knew these woods, had scouted them during his nocturnal reconnaissance, had identified a route that would take them to a creek they could follow north, using the water to mask their scent. Behind them, Oakidge Plantation glowed with light and echoed with laughter, oblivious to what had just happened. Richard Marlowe was still drinking with his guests, still bragging about his success, still completely unaware that his giant slave had just executed a plan that would destroy everything he'd built. They reached the tree line without incident. Elijah paused, looking back one final time at the place that had held his mother captive for 3 years, the place that represented everything evil about the system of slavery. Then he turned north and led his small band of fugitives into the darkness. They traveled through the night, following the creek as planned, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Oakidge before the alarm was raised. Elijah set a brutal pace. He knew that every mile they covered tonight could mean the difference between freedom and recapture. The others struggled to keep up, especially Ruth and Abigail, both older and weakened by years of hard labor. But they pushed through exhaustion and fear, driven by the knowledge that there was no going back. By dawn, they had covered nearly 15 miles. Elijah found a dense thicket near a ravine and ordered everyone to rest. They were exhausted, their feet bleeding, their bodies pushed past normal limits. But they were also farther from Oakidge than any of them had imagined possible. How long before they realize we're gone? Clara asked, her voice hoarse from exertion. The party will probably continue until 2 or 3 in the morning, Elijah estimated. They won't check the quarters until dawn at the earliest. That gives us maybe 6 or 7 hours before the alarm is raised. By the time they organize a search party, we'll have a full day's head start. And the horses being scattered will slow them down, Samuel added. The dogs being drugged will slow them even more, Hannah said. Ruth looked at her son with an expression of wonder. You really did it. You planned all of this, infiltrated the plantation, gathered allies, executed an escape that everyone said was impossible. How? Elijah was quiet for a moment before responding. You taught me to never accept injustice. Papa taught me to think like a hunter. The rest I figured out along the way. He looked around at the group, 8 people who had risked everything for freedom. But I couldn't have done it alone. Every one of you was essential. Every one of you is the reason we're sitting here right now instead of still being enslaved. So what happens now? Moses asked. Now we keep moving, Elijah said. We travel by night, hide by day. We head north toward Tennessee, then Kentucky, then Ohio. There are people along the way who will help, safe houses, conductors on the Underground Railroad. It won't be easy. Some of us might not make it. But we have a real chance. They rested through the hot Georgia day, taking turns keeping watch. As the sun climbed higher, Elijah allowed himself to think about what he had accomplished. He had infiltrated a plantation, endured weeks of slavery, built a network of allies, gathered intelligence, and executed a plan that freed 8 people, including his mother. But more than that, he had proven something important, that enslaved people were not helpless, not powerless, not doomed to accept their bondage. With intelligence, courage, and careful planning, they could fight back. As evening approached and they prepared to resume their journey, Elijah took a moment alone with his mother. I'm sorry it took so long to find you, he said quietly. Ruth shook her head, tears streaming down her face. You came. That's what matters. You risked everything to come for me. What mother could ask for more? They held each other for a long moment, and Elijah felt the weight of the past 3 years lifting slightly. She wasn't free yet, none of them were, not until they crossed into free territory. But they were no longer slaves. They were fugitives, yes, but fugitives who had chosen their own path, who had struck back against their oppressors, who had proven that the system of slavery was not as invincible as it pretended to be. As darkness fell, the group began walking again, heading north by the light of the stars. Behind them, they knew Oakidge Plantation had erupted into chaos. The discovery of their escape would have triggered a massive manhunt, riders sent to neighboring plantations, to sheriffs, to slave catchers. Rewards posted. Dogs unleashed, though the drugged bloodhounds would be useless for hours yet. But Elijah had planned for all of this. The scattered horses would delay mounted pursuit. The corrupted ledger would make accurate descriptions difficult. The head start they'd gained would be nearly impossible to overcome. And the route he'd chosen, following waterways, avoiding roads, moving through terrain difficult for large groups to search, would make them very hard to track. 3 days later, they crossed into Tennessee. 6 days after that, they reached the first safe house, a small farm owned by Quakers, who asked no questions and provided food, rest, and directions to the next station on the Underground Railroad. 12 days after leaving Oakidge, they crossed into Kentucky. And 23 days after their escape, On a cold October morning, 8 former slaves crossed the Ohio River into free territory. They had made it. Against impossible odds, with nothing but courage and careful planning. They had achieved what the system of slavery insisted was impossible. They were free. Years later, when Elijah was an old man living in Canada, he would tell the story of his infiltration of Oakidge Plantation to his grandchildren. He would describe how he had pretended to be weak, how he had endured weeks of slavery, how he had systematically dismantled the security of a plantation and led 8 people to freedom. His grandchildren would listen with wide eyes, barely able to believe that their gentle grandfather had once been the most dangerous slave a plantation owner ever bought. But the part of the story that Elijah always emphasized, the lesson he most wanted them to understand, was this: the people who enslaved others wanted the enslaved to believe they were powerless. They wanted them to accept their bondage as natural, inevitable, God-ordained. But it was all a lie. The enslaved had power, the power of intelligence, of courage, of community, of resistance. And when they chose to use that power, when they refused to accept injustice, extraordinary things became possible. Richard Marlowe never recovered from the escape. The loss of 8 slaves was financially damaging, but the blow to his reputation was worse. Other plantation owners whispered about his incompetence, about how he'd been outsmarted by a slave he thought was simple and weak. The story spread, became legend, the tale of the giant who wasn't what he seemed, who infiltrated a plantation and freed his mother and 7 others. It became a source of hope for enslaved people across the South, a reminder that resistance was possible, that freedom could be won. Catherine Marlowe, for her part, never forgave herself for not trusting her instincts. She had known there was something different about Jonas, something dangerous beneath the surface. But she hadn't acted on that knowledge, and it had cost them dearly. She lived the rest of her life with the knowledge that she had seen the truth and ignored it. As for Elijah, he lived to see the end of slavery, lived to see the Civil War and emancipation and the slow, painful reconstruction of a nation built on bondage. He raised children and grandchildren in freedom, taught them to read and write, gave them opportunities he'd had to fight for. And he never forgot the 8 people who had trusted him enough to risk everything for a chance at freedom. Because that night when they walked away from Oakidge Plantation and headed north toward freedom, they had done more than escape. They had proven that they were not property, not objects to be owned and controlled. They were human beings with agency and courage and the fundamental right to determine their own destiny. And no one, not Richard Marlowe, not the slave catchers, not the entire system of slavery itself, could ever take that away from them. They had chosen freedom. And that choice, that single act of defiance in the face of overwhelming oppression, was worth more than all the plantations in the South.